In this chapter, we're going to look at how to create a legal risk management plan. If you remember to the beginning of this course, it isn't about teaching you how to be a lawyer. It's about teaching you how to recognize and mitigate legal risks. As always, I've provided you with a slide that outlines what I really want you to take from this chapter. So first is you should understand the methods of managing the legal environment of business. You should also be able to develop a legal risk management plan. In fact, you will do one of those as an assignment for this course. Next, the importance of anticipating and reacting to developments in the legal environment, because as we saw in the earlier chapters, the law is always changing. And then finally, we'll talk about how to access and manage legal services. I want you to be able to recognize and mitigate legal issues in your organization. If you don't, you are more prone to legal mistakes, and legal mistakes can be costly, distracting, and harmful. These legal mistakes are costly in terms of the expense of legal services and damage claims. They're distracting in terms of the organization's effort and time, and they can be harmful in terms of relationships with their customers and their reputation. As I've mentioned previously, in this module, you will be developing a legal risk management plan. So let's talk about what that is. It's a comprehensive action plan for dealing with the legal risks inherently involved in the operation of the business. When you think of a legal risk, think about a business risk that has legal implications. In order to determine what your legal risks are, you need to involve managers and employees at every level. And you can use a variety of methods, such as surveying, interviewing managers and employees, forming committees, or even seeking information from an outside panel of experts. We do this to attempt to identify and manage the threats that could generate negative legal consequences. So we want to avoid things like fines and penalties and compliance orders and license suspensions. And we can't do these things if we're not aware of the law in our particular industry, or the law as it applies to our particular industries. Sometimes a legal risk management plan is part of a bigger risk management plan, which we call an enterprise risk management plan, which identifies and manages all business risks. And a legal risk management plan is just one part of that. So what are the steps? The first is to identify the legal risks. Step 2 is evaluation of those risks. Step 3 is to devise a risk management plan, and step 4 is to implement the plan. In the sections that follow, we'll look at each of these steps in more detail. So step 1 is identifying the legal risks. This is the most critical step. Your goal here is to be reasonably certain that no major risks have been overlooked. You probably won't ever catch them all, but you should be aware of the biggest and most common risks in your type of business operation. So how do we do this? What kind of analysis can we do in order to identify the legal risks? There are different approaches, and it depends on the type of business. We could, for example, look at the organization's functional areas. So think of your functional areas as part of your business degree. So you take some marketing courses, you take some finance courses, you might take some human resource courses. Those are all different functional areas of business. So you might decide to do your analysis by looking at each functional area independently. You can have the folks in your marketing department brainstorm and identify some of the legal risks in their area. Similarly, the folks in the HR department would probably have some expertise in the areas of legal risk in their department. So one of the ways is to analyze the organization's functional areas, and by this we mean marketing, production, finance. Another way we could go about this is if we want to review the organization's business decisions. So it means that whenever we're faced with a new decision, it could be a new market, it could be new equipment that we want to purchase, it could be new products that we're thinking about selling. We could analyze the legal risk associated with each one of those new phenomena. The third way is we could look at business relationships. So if an organization has maybe 5 or 6 major customers or major business relationships, we could identify the legal risks by studying each one of those business relationships separately. And then finally, we could identify the legal risk by analyzing the organization's operations and transactions. And a good example here would be a utility company that has varied power generation methods. So maybe it generates power through wind, through coal, through oil, through nuclear energy. And what would happen is you would analyze each one of those operations to identify legal risk. The key here is to be methodical. The key is to pick a system that makes the most sense for the type of business and use that system to methodically look at the legal risks that might be faced by your organization. So here are some examples of potential legal risks. First, the business could harm the environment and result in prosecution under environmental legislation or civil actions by affected people. Similarly, employee harassment could result in a human rights complaint or a human rights investigation. Aggressive marketing could result in investigation under the Federal Competition Act. Machine breakdown could result in a loss of production and the inability to fill contracts. This could result in a lawsuit for breach of contract. So these are all different areas where there are potential legal risks. Now, because I'm going to ask you to come up with a legal risk management plan eventually, what I'm going to do as I go through the 4 steps is apply a mini case. So here's the case. 4 business graduates have decided to open a sports bar in Wolfville. They were attentive in their business law class, and they've remembered that they need a legal risk management plan. So what do they need to do first? First, they need to identify the legal risks. Next, they need to consider which approach to risk assessment could make the most sense. I'm going to propose, just for interest's sake, that they use an examination of their functional areas. So for sales and marketing, we're talking about what they refer to as front of house in a restaurant situation. So this is where customers come in and are served. Then we have production, which would be back of house. So we've got the kitchen and the cleaning, that type of thing. We could also look at the functional area of accounting and record keeping. And then finally, we could look at the human resource function. An analysis of the legal risks in each of these functional areas will help us identify which legal risks we need to mitigate. So I'm going to run through a couple of examples. You would do this in more depth for your assignment, but just for the purposes of illustration, we'll do it quite quickly. So let's look at the function of sales and marketing. So let's think about a sports bar. What are some of the risks associated with serving customers? Well, we know whenever there is the service of alcohol, there are pretty strict regulations around overserving. Similarly, there are strict regulations around underage customers. Something else that could happen in sales and marketing or front of house in the restaurant industry could be you have a customer slip and fall. So these are all potential legal risks. Let's look at production. So we're talking about back of house. We have potential injuries for our employees. When you're working around fryers and kitchens and kitchen equipment and sharp knives, we need to think about the risk associated with employee injuries. We could also look at improper food handling. The last thing we want to do is serve our customers food that is going to make them ill. And so we need to think about the legal risks around improper food handling. Let's think about human resources for a minute. There could be occupational health and safety infractions. Maybe we're not providing our employees with the right protective equipment. We could also look at employee harassment. And finally, we could look at employment discrimination. These are all areas of legal risk associated with the function of human resources. And then finally, for the sake of this illustration, is we could look at accounting and record keeping. So what about data management? How do we keep client and supplier information confidential? How do we make sure we don't have any breaches in our data security? And then another legal risk in the accounting and record keeping department could be the inability to pay suppliers. So what happens if we don't manage our finances well and we're unable to pay our suppliers? So these are just some examples of legal risks as identified by looking at the functional areas of the organization. So now we move to step 2, which is evaluating the risks. Let's face it, all risks are not alike, and they shouldn't be treated alike. The key to effectively managing risk is to assess the probability of it actually occurring, and then assessing the severity of the impact on the business if it does occur. Some businesses use really sophisticated mathematical programs to do these calculations, but many organizations, especially small organizations, simply use history, intuition, or gut instinct. When you do this analysis, you want to understand how likely it is to happen. If it's not likely and it's not very severe, you're probably going to afford it less attention than something that, if it occurs, is catastrophic. So some risks become a liability often, but their impact is minimal, where some risks materialize rarely, but the impact is severe. Here's a little matrix that you can use to assess the risk, to evaluate the risk. And you'll see that I have the severity of impact along the side and the probability of the event occurring across the top. And so for each one of the risks that you identify, you should try and map them into a grid like this one to figure out the severity and the probability. Depending on the severity of the impact and the probability of it occurring, you will choose legal mitigation techniques, and we'll talk more about those. So let's think about the mini case in order to apply this second step. What I would ask you to do is, for each of the risks that you identified earlier, is assess the probability of occurrence and the severity if it did occur. I'll take you through a few examples. You would do a more thorough analysis, obviously, for an assignment, but I'll just take you through a few so that you understand what I'm talking about. So let's think about production. And this was the back of the house. This is where all of the cooks are busily preparing the food for the customers. This is where they receive produce. And one of the legal risks that we identified was injuries. And so there is a risk of our employees getting injured. And so we think about, well, how likely is it that they'll get injured? And you know what? Minor injuries occur quite often in restaurants. And so we would say the probability of it occurring is high, but the severity in most cases is low. It could be a burnt finger or needing a Band-Aid, that kind of thing. That's not to suggest that more catastrophic injuries can't occur, but those catastrophic injuries have a low probability, even though they have a high severity. What about improper food handling? That was one of the legal risks that we identified. The probability of that occurring is probably low, but if it does occur and we make all of our customers sick, the severity of it could be high. We could then look at human resources. One of the ones that we identified was employment discrimination. So when we're hiring, we have to think about and be conscious of not discriminating against potential applicants. The probability of occurring is most likely low, but the severity could be quite high if a human rights complaint is filed against us. If we think about accounting and record keeping, we could think about data management and breaches in security. Again, the probability is low, but the severity could be high if it is revealed that we lose all of our customer data. When assessing the risks and thinking about the probability of them occurring and the severity of the outcome if they do, there's areas where we can access information. For example, we could look internally. We could look at our own loss history. We could seek expert opinions from people who work in the different functional areas. And we can look externally. We could look at industry statistics, and we could seek expert opinions from outside of the organization as well. Okay, so moving on to step 3, and that is to devise a risk management plan. Your textbook suggests 4 strategies. There are others, but we're going to focus on 4. And these strategies are for dealing with the risks after you've identified them and then evaluated them. The 4 strategies are to 1, avoid or eliminate the risk altogether, 2, reduce the risk, 3, transfer the risk, and 4, retain the risk. So I'll give you an example of each of these. Risk avoidance means stopping a business activity because the legal risk is simply too great. An example of this would be an organization that's considering entering a new market. Perhaps this market is in a country that is politically very unstable, and if the risk is deemed too great, then the best strategy might just be to avoid it altogether, to cease the business activity. The second one is risk reduction. So this means having a practice in the business that will lower the probability of loss or the severity of the loss. Very often this looks like training. An example would be offering health and safety training and developing a system for recording and auditing workplace accidents. The next one is risk transference, and this means shifting the risk to someone else through a contract. Usually, we mean doing this through insurance. When there is a potential for significant legal risk, very often organizations will purchase insurance to mitigate that risk. The last strategy is risk retention. So retention means keeping or absorbing all or part of the risk within the organization. This approach is appropriate when the cost of avoiding or transferring risk is greater than the impact on the business if the risk materializes. So this is appropriate for small risks that don't pose significant financial loss. There are 3 ways that organizations can retain the risk. The first is through something called self-insurance. And basically, it means that the organization establishes a fund that they hold in reserve in case the risk should materialize. The second is through an insurance policy deductible. So what happens here is the organization does purchase insurance, but they retain the risk up to a certain dollar amount. This is probably like your car insurance. You have insurance maybe up to $1 million in liability to mitigate your own legal risk, but you have a deductible of up to $500. And so that would be you are retaining that amount of the risk, the $500. And then the last one is technically more complex. We're not going to go into it, but it's called non-insurance. It basically means that the organization can charge the losses as an expense item. Again, that's pretty much all you need to know about non-insurance because it's fairly complicated. This slide shows you some suggested strategies. So it suggests that if you have a low severity or impact and a low probability of the event occurring, you would use the retain strategy, which makes sense. It's not likely to happen, but if it does happen, it's not going to cost us a lot of money, so we're just going to retain that risk. Maybe we'll have a reserve fund. If there's a high probability of an event occurring with low severity or impact, perhaps then we'd use the reduce strategy. And so it's something that's fairly common but doesn't have a big impact. So maybe we'll do some training. That would be in the reduce strategy. So we can apply this to the mini case and think about some of the risks that we identified. One of them was injury. So perhaps we're talking about slip fall injuries that might happen with our customers because there's lots of things to slip on in food and beverage service. We probably would want to transfer that risk by purchasing some insurance. If we think about improper food handling, this is something that could occur regularly. And one of the things that we might do to mitigate this is to engage in risk reduction through training. So perhaps monthly our employees are asked to, freshen up their food handling and food safety training through video training or maybe through coursework. When it comes to improper food handling, we might also transfer some of that risk by, again, purchasing liability insurance. One of the risks we talked about was employment discrimination in hiring. This is something that could occur. It is not something that we can insure against, but we can reduce our risk by offering training. So making sure that our human resource professionals and our managers that do hiring have good training when it comes to recruiting, hiring, firing, and any other areas where discrimination might occur. So the final step is implementing the plan. The key point here is in the allocation of responsibility for implementing and monitoring the plan. It's great to have a plan, but if people aren't assigned specific tasks and held accountable for them, the plan has very little meaning. In order to work, the plan must be understood and it needs to be used. Otherwise, it's just another document sitting on company shelves. So when carrying out the plan, you must clearly assign responsibility. So perhaps the head in your kitchen, maybe the head chef, is responsible for recording and auditing workplace accidents. When carrying out the plan, you need some really clear guidelines on how to carry out any procedures needed, including inspections, accident reporting, and the like. And then the last step is to monitor and revise the plan. So a regular review process is needed and should be revised when necessary. So remember, just as the law is always changing and regulations are always changing, so are organizations. And so having a regular review process for your plan is incredibly important. And that's it for this lesson. I encourage you to complete the knowledge check assignment that you'll find on the ACORN page.